Hi friends, my name is Derek. I'm host of Talking with Famous People, and I'd like to talk today a little bit about meta-rationalism and subjective realities. I'm going to start by reading this comment from legendzfall, which is certainly a comment that I easily enough could have written myself. The following is the province of philosophy, not politics. However, I'm going to point it out anyway. The fundamental nature of existence is such that pragmatism, when in conflict with that which is moral, can never be practical. I would posit that pragmatism is probably the major reason the world is in such a mess currently. Ends cannot justify means, and you cannot achieve the good by abandoning principles any more than you could by having the wrong principles and sticking to them. A broad enough, well integrated enough view will always reveal this simple truth. The all-time score in this game is reality infinite, pragmatism zero. The first thing I actually want to point out about this comment is one of the problems here is he's basically saying, as a matter of fact, the principal choice is always the utilitarian choice as well. It's just that we're not calculating impacts correctly. I think it's fair to say that you can't establish that without relying on the same kind of normative framework that you purport oughtn't to be used to justify things, right? So, if in fact the ends don't justify the means, then you can't justify principalism by saying that it's ultimately more practical. After all, having the best impacts is not a justification. So, your claim here is trying to conflate the two, but I get what you're saying, except for the part about pragmatism never being practical, which I disagree with because it is the case that some people have an interested calculus, and that what's practical for them may be impractical for other people, and nevertheless remain practical for them. So it is the case, there's a difference between the prescriptive and the normative, which means there's a difference between what's good for you and what's morally good. It's silly to try to pretend there's not. So, but aside from that, I basically am of the same mindset of you regarding principalism. I've written extensively and talked extensively on the subject. However, I've had to grow up a bit, so to speak, and I don't mean to be dismissive of your perspective as immature, which I realize now that it's already out of my mouth. That's what that does, and I'm sorry about that. I don't want to dismiss other people's perspectives. Certainly not one that I so wholeheartedly, sort of feel the gist of as much as this one. But here's the thing. The job of the president, and really I think the ultimate responsibility of a human being, if they can attain it, is to attain what I would call Meta-Rationalism, which is non-ideological framing. So any frame, when totalized, including a rights frame, results in totalitarianism ultimately. Language is static, relatively, compared to people's behavior. So, like right now, the COVID narrative is predominant, and so certain aspects of that narrative have predominated public discourse in kind of a very aggressively imperialistic fashion. And as a consequence, we're kind of stuck with these narratives until some of the more true narratives start to gain traction and the story turns around. The fact is, if we were to expect a president to go into office and always make principled decisions, it would be extraordinarily difficult because only some of those decisions present clear moral calculi that allow for decision making and action as needs to be allowed for. But the core thing is to not totalize a frame. The only frame that I'm willing to totalize here then is not totalizing a frame. That if we're totalizing a frame, we're denying a quality of reality that's important, which is contextual differences require sometimes different deliberative approaches or frames of reference. And you have to be able to distinguish between those instances. And sometimes it can be a great challenge because the job of a president necessarily entails swearing to uphold the Constitution and represent the interests of the country and the people of the country. And even that might run afoul of some of the dictates of principlism. So it's like if you're willing to take the job, you're putting yourself in a bit of a bind if you want to be a strict principlist. You've already sworn to uphold the Constitution, but you're inheriting a federal government that does not uphold the Constitution. So this is the response I actually wrote here in those comments. First, I said, I well understand what you're saying here. It's the barrier you have to cross to attain meta-rationalism. The answer to the apparently irreconcilable contradiction is fully realized self-concept, aka not driven by fear. I also completely get that you're likely to find this answer entirely unsatisfactory, as it's a holistic truth and is also a subjective or personal claim, and it's not subject to your verification in this specific instance with me, and concurrently strongly contraindicated by the existing data about leaders and whatnot in general. In other words, the reliability of people to manage this contradiction without simply excusing themselves from principlism when convenient. There's no principlism, is the argument here, if it's not applied consistently, because to be principled means to elect not to take a course of action, even though it seems very promising, because it violates some stricture that precludes you from taking action. When dealing with people like you, legendzfall, and like myself, because I'm like legendzfall as well in a lot of ways, I'm best served to simply point out that you can trust me more with the reins than you do any other option, or ever have about any other considered option, and that no one else will or even can engage with you honestly about the matter you bring up. Then I give a second comment because I still wanted to say more, and now I'm making this video because I still felt like this needs to be addressed because it's an important thing. One of the things I'm doing here in running for president is breaking away from any ideological chains that still bound me to static truths that can't fundamentally be relied on to deal with a dynamic reality as well as my more complete understanding can. The basic issue is this: a president has no choice but to be pragmatic because he's not brought in to create from scratch. Recall the trash dumped in the ocean analogy. If removed right away, great. If 20 years pass and a reef grows around the trash, we need to be able to think in a more nuanced way if we're going to actually be making decisions and taking action or choosing inaction. And that's the thing, we need to choose inaction. It's not acceptable for a president to default to inaction. In part because only some of the decisions that must be made present a clearly framed rights question, and defaulting to inaction is the basic engine of principlism. But I may, for example, be presented with a bill that recovers some rights protections currently not enforced and that also violates some rights in some area. Real non-utilitarian principlism in such a case would preclude me from using an impact calculus to sign the bill, even if doing so produces a net benefit to negative rights. I should just make a video about this. Ultimately, you're forgetting something significant. Yes, utilitarianism is generally used to justify rights violations. And remember, the fallacious reasoning doesn't cause false conclusions. It just fails to substantiate the conclusion claimed. And while I oppose bad policy, and I agree that utilitarianism correlates with bad policy, you should remember that none of the people who comprise that strong correlation between util and bad policy understand any of these framework realities that I've just articulated. So even if you're correct that the all-time score is infinite to zero, it's about to become a close game. The point is, basically, I can be trusted with utilitarianism where others cannot. That it makes sense to ask people to totalize the safest ideology to totalize, which is rights. Rights protection, principalism, autonomy protection, individualism is the most defensible and the safest of all the possible ideologies to totalize. But it nevertheless is still a totalizing ideology if totalized. And I'm not going to allow myself to fall into the trap that everybody else falls into of having to take a single frame and try to totalize it. Try to have an agenda driving things rather than a principled technocratic approach to every specific policy issue that incorporates a clear calculus of rights impacts and precludes action where the president is empowered to do so when it has negative rights impacts, unless there's compelling reason to do otherwise. And there may be compelling reasons to do otherwise. The key thing here is I'm not going to pretend that this doesn't present a logical contradiction or a challenge to me in terms of justifying things. I can't say in which instance I'm going to be presented or posed a situation that's going to require me to make a decision that's based on utilitarianism that makes me feel kind of dirty. You know, it's like I don't like how imperfect this thing is, but I have a limited, finite set of choices, and it's the best available choice. So I can't tell you when or how that's going to happen, but I can tell you this. To be a good president, I need to acknowledge right off the bat as a candidate that it's possible and that I am not going to be a slave to any ideology. I will make the best choice for the country and everybody. And not only that, I will stand up afterwards and explain exactly what all the actual impacts are, negative and positive. You know, own up to those parties harmed by my action as best I can and justify it according to a holistic set of justifications as best I can. Is that the best response to this would be, Eric, all of this whole video is just you saying, ultimately, your judgment is so good that we can trust you to be unprincipled. Yep. That's what I'm saying. I wouldn't suggest you trust anybody else with this, but yeah, that's what I'm saying.